Alright, in this module we're going to look at angle relationships. Before we look into angle relationships, we're going to review what we do know currently or have learned in the past about angles. Classifying angles in geometry, we have four options. The first is an acute angle. An acute angle is an angle that is less than 90 degrees. So when I'm staring at an angle that is less than 90, we can identify it or classify it as an acute angle. A right angle is an angle that is equivalent to 90 degrees. A good indicator that something is a right angle is we're going to see this small little box right at the vertex of the angle. That's if we don't have that, we would say the lines are, or the two angles or the rays are perpendicular to each other, but that symbol is usually going to be involved in a 90-degree angle. Another angle is an obtuse angle. Obtuse is any angle greater than 90 degrees. So notice in both acute and obtuse, we are measuring against 90 or measuring against that right angle. And then our fourth angle is a straight angle. A straight angle is going to look like a line. It's actually going to be comprised of two rays. So I have a ray to the right, a ray to the left. That's going to be equal to 180 degrees. And it turns out in this module, this right angle, or this equaling 90 and this equaling 180, are going to play a pretty crucial role. So we're going to take our learning of angles a little further in this module, and we're going to look at angle relationships. So we're going to focus on four angle relationships today, and our goal is to be able to identify these angle relationships. So we're going to start with adjacent angles. Adjacent is a vocab term that means next to. So when we think about adjacent angles, we're talking about two angles that are next to each other. To be considered adjacent from a geometry standpoint, they need to share a common vertex and they need to share a common side. So if I'm looking at these two angles, so I have an angle, we'll call it angle 1, and then I have this angle here, angle 2. Angle 1 and angle 2 are considered adjacent angles. Again, share this side. So this red ray, I need that one to make both angles. So whether I'm talking about angle 2 or I'm talking about angle 1, I'm going to kind of trace that red line twice. So adjacent angles would be two angles that share a vertex, so that's referring to this point here, and a side. We like to think of them as right next to each other. As far as for adjacent angles, that really their only important thing about adjacent angles is that they're next to each other. They have no mathematical meaning, meaning there's no real significance to the fact that they're next to each other other than they are next to each other. So those are going to be considered adjacent angles. Another relationship we have are vertical angles. Vertical angles are formed by two lines that intersect. So these two black lines, they intersect each other, they form an X. When two lines form an X or intersect at a single point, we create four angles. That's always going to occur. The vertical angles themselves are across from each other. So for example, here in this diagram, 1 and 3 are vertical angles to each other. 2 are vertical angles to each other. So we're going kind of across that intersection. So we have vertical angles when we have two angles that are formed by intersecting lines. It's the only way that they're formed. And here we're going to remind ourselves that they are across from each other. They are across from each other. We would not say that 1 and 2 are vertical. We would say 1 and 3 are vertical. Now, there is really important mathematical significance with this relationship. So it's a little different than the adjacent. And the mathematical significance is that these angles are what we call, in geometry, congruent. And congruent simply means that they have the same measure. They have the same measure. For example, if I said that angle 3 was 40 degrees, that means angle 1 also is 40 degrees. So the fact that they are congruent, and that's always going to be true, they share the same measurement. Another relationship we'll talk about then is complementary angles. Complementary angles are going to focus on those two big measurements we talked about in the review, 90 degrees and 180 degrees. Looking at complementary angles, complementary angles are angles that add to 90 degrees. And it's important to note going to write 2 angles. So I have 2 angles that add to 90 degrees. Those angles can be adjacent. Remember, that means next to. So in this diagram, I have 2 angles that are adjacent, right next to each other. And oftentimes, we're going to see this 90-degree marking, this right angle marking. And this is something that's really important because this tells us 90 degrees. It tells us that they add to 90 degrees. We can also have 2 angles that are non-adjacent and still complementary. So here, 30 degrees plus 60 degrees equals 90 degrees. So we can classify these as complementary but not adjacent. We can classify these angles as complementary and adjacent. Now, it's important to know that if you have multiple options, you always want to list multiple options. But which is more important to list in this example would be complementary. And complementary is more important to know because there's a mathematical significance. And the mathematical significance is that they add to 90 degrees. So we're going to kind of keep that in our back pocket for classifying those. Supplementary angles then are our angles that add to 180. And again, we're talking about 2 angles that add to 180 degrees. We have an adjacent example. So this angle of 60 degrees and 120 degrees. These are together forming what we call a straight angle. So this line is super important to look for when they're pushed together like that or they're adjacent, because that tells us that it adds to 180. In our non-adjacent example, we know that 60 degrees plus 120 degrees equals 180 degrees. So these are our examples of our 4 relationships, and we want to use these key facts. So I'm just going to go back through them one more time. For our adjacent angles, adjacent means next to. They're 2 angles smushed up to each other, sharing a vertex and one common side. Vertical angles are formed at an intersection or an X formed by those lines. The pair of vertical angles will always be across from one another. And they share this significance mathematically that they're congruent, meaning they have the same measurement. Complementary angles, those are 2 angles that add to 90 degrees, either adjacent or non-adjacent. looking for that 90-degree marking. Supplementary angles, they are two angles that add to 180 degrees, looking for that straight angle or line, because we know that that is 180 degrees itself. And these are our 4 angle relationships.